The Blue Cross. G.K. Chesterton. Early one morning, the boat arrived at Harwich, and from it poured a crowd of travellers. Among them, the man that we must follow did not look out of place in any way, nor did he wish to. There was nothing out of the ordinary about him, except a slight difference between the relaxed look of his holiday clothes and the rather serious expression on his face. He was wearing a pale grey coat, a white shirt, and a silver hat. His thin face was dark in comparison, and ended in a short black beard that looked rather Spanish. He was smoking. No one would have thought that the grey coat hid a loaded gun, that the pocket of his white shirt held a police card, or that the hat covered one of the most powerful brains in Europe. For this was Valentine himself, the head of the Paris police and the most famous detective in the world. And he was coming from Brussels to London to make the greatest arrest of the century. Flambeau was in England. The police of 3 countries had tracked the great criminal at last, from Ghent to Brussels, from Brussels to the Hook of Holland, and it was thought that he would make use of the unfamiliarity and confusion of the international meeting of priests, which was then taking place in London. Probably he would travel as some unimportant clerk or secretary connected with it. But of course, Valentine could not be certain. Nobody could be certain about Flambeau. It is many years now since this great criminal, Flambeau, suddenly stopped causing trouble. And when he stopped, there was relief around the world. In his best days, I mean, of course, his worst, Flambeau was an internationally known figure. Almost every morning, the daily papers announced that he had escaped punishment for one unbelievable crime by breaking the law a second time. He was a Frenchman of great strength, size, and daring, and the wildest stories were told of the amusing uses that he made of his physical abilities. How he turned a judge upside down and stood him on his head to clear his mind. How he ran down the street with a policeman under each arm. But it must be said of him that his unusual physical strength was generally employed in bloodless ways. His crimes were chiefly those of clever robberies. It was he who ran the great Tyrolean Milk Company in London, with no cows, no delivery vehicles, and no milk, but with more than 1,000 customers. He did this by the simple operation of moving the little milk cans outside people's doors to the doors of his own customers. Many of his crimes were extremely simple. It is said that he once repainted all the house numbers in a street in the middle of the night, just to lead one traveller into a trap. It is quite certain that he invented a public letterbox which could be moved from place to place. This he put up in quiet corners of the town, in the hope that a stranger might drop a cheque or banknote into it. Lastly, he was known to be very quick and active, in spite of his large size. He could jump as well as any insect and hide in the treetops, like a monkey. For this reason, the great Valentine, when he set out to find Flambeau, knew very well that his adventures would not end when he had found him. But how would he find him? The great Valentine still did not have a plan. There was one thing about himself which Flambeau could not change, whatever he did to his appearance, and that was his unusual height. If Valentine's quick eye had seen a tall apple seller, a tall soldier, or even a fairly tall woman, he might have arrested them immediately. But just as a lion cannot pretend to be a mouse, so there was nobody now on his train who could be Flambeau, dressed as someone else. Valentine had already made certain that he was not among the people on the boat, and only 6 other people had got on the train at Harwich or during the journey. There was a short railway official travelling up to London, 3 fairly short farmers, picked up 2 stations later, 1 very short old lady, going up from a small town in Essex, and a very short Catholic priest, going up from an Essex village. When it came to this last passenger, Valentine gave up looking and almost laughed. The little priest had a round, dull face. He had eyes as empty as the North Sea. He had several packages wrapped in brown paper, which he was quite unable to hold without dropping one. The meeting of priests in London must have brought out of their quiet villages many similar creatures who seemed blind and helpless, like underground animals dug out of the earth. Even Valentine, who had no love of priests, felt sorry for this one. He had a large, worn suitcase, which kept falling on the floor. He explained to everybody with a kind of foolish simplicity that he had to be careful, because he had something made of real silver with blue stones in one of his brown paper packages. Watching the priest's confusion continued to amuse the Frenchman, until this simple man got out, somehow, at Stratford with all his packages, and came back for his suitcase. When he returned for this, Valentine even had the good nature to warn him not to take care of his silver by telling everybody about it. But whoever he talked to, Valentine watched for someone else. He looked out for anyone, rich or poor, male or female, who was at least 6 feet tall. For Flambeau was 4 inches above this height. He got off the train in central London, though, quite sure that he had not missed the criminal so far. When he had been to Scotland Yard to arrange for help if it was needed, he went for a long walk in the streets of London. As he was walking in the streets and squares beyond Victoria, he stopped suddenly. He was in a quiet, attractive square, very typical of London. The tall, flat houses looked both expensive and empty. The gardens in the centre looked as deserted as a green Pacific island. One of the 4 sides of the square was much higher than the rest, like a stage, and the line of this side was broken by a restaurant. The restaurant stood specially high above the street, and some steps ran up from the street to the front door. Valentine stood and smoked in front of the yellow-white curtains and studied them for a long time. Aristide Valentine was a thinking man. All his wonderful successes had been gained by slow, patient reasoning, by clear and ordinary French thought. But because Valentine understood reason, he understood its limits. Only a man who knows nothing about cars talks of driving without petrol. Only a man who knows nothing of reason talks of reasoning without any hard facts to start with. Flambeau had been missed at Harwich, and if he was in London at all, he might be anything from a tall beggar sleeping in one of the parks to an employee of the Metropole Hotel. When he lacked any such certain knowledge, Valentine had a view and a method of his own. In such cases, he trusted in the unexpected. In such cases, when reasoning was no use to him, he coldly and carefully looked for the unreasonable. Instead of going to the right places, banks, police stations, meeting places, he went to the wrong places. He knocked at every empty house, turned down every little side street, walked up every path. He defended this strange course of action quite reasonably. He said that if he had any facts about the criminal's movements to guide him, this was the worst way. But if he had no facts at all, it was the best. There was just the chance that anything unusual which caught the eye of the hunter might be the same that had caught the eye of the hunted. A man must begin somewhere, and it might as well be just where another man might stop. Something about the steps leading up to the shop, something about the quiet and rather unusual appearance of the restaurant, gave the detective an idea and made him decide to act without a plan. He went up the steps, sat down by the window, and asked for a cup of black coffee. Until his coffee came, he sat thinking about Flambeau. The criminal always had the advantage. He could make his plans and act. The detective could only wait and hope that he would make a mistake. Valentine lifted his coffee cup to his lips slowly and put it down very quickly. He had put salt in it. He looked at the container from which the white powder had come. It was certainly a sugar bowl. Why had they put salt in it? He looked around for a salt container. Yes, there were two which were quite full. Perhaps there was something unusual about what was in them, too. He tasted it. It was sugar. Then he looked round at the restaurant with new interest, to see if there were any other signs of that strange artistic taste which puts sugar in the salt containers and salt in the sugar bowls. Except for a strange mark of some dark liquid on one of the white walls, the whole place appeared neat, cheerful, and ordinary. He rang the bell for the waiter. When the waiter hurried up to him, his hair uncombed and his eyes rather tired at that early hour, the detective asked him to taste the sugar and see if it was equal to the high standards of the restaurant. The result was that the waiter suddenly woke up. "Do you play this fine joke on people every morning?" inquired Valentine. "Do you never grow tired of the joke of changing the salt and the sugar?" When it became clear to the waiter what Valentine meant, he explained that the restaurant certainly had no such intention. It must be a strange mistake. He picked up the sugar bowl and looked at it. He picked up the salt container and looked at that, his face growing more and more confused. At last, he quickly excused himself, hurried away, and returned in a few seconds with the owner of the place. The owner also examined the sugar bowl and then the salt container. The owner also looked confused. Suddenly, the waiter started to speak with a rush of words. "I think," he said eagerly, "I think it was those two priests." "What two priests?" "The two priests," said the waiter, "that threw soup at the wall." "Threw soup at the wall?" repeated Valentine. "Yes, yes," said the waiter with excitement, and pointed to the large brown mark on the white wall. "Threw it over there, on the wall." Valentine looked questioningly at the restaurant owner. "Yes, sir," he said. "It's quite true, although I don't suppose it has anything to do with the sugar and salt. Two priests came in and drank soup here very early, as soon as we opened. They were both very quiet, respectable people. One of them paid the bill and went out. The other, who seemed much slower, was some minutes longer collecting his things together. He went at last, but the moment before he stepped into the street, he deliberately picked up his cup, which he had only half emptied, and threw the soup straight at the wall. I was in the back room myself, and so was the waiter, so I could only rush out in time to find the soup running down the wall and the shop empty. It didn't do any particular damage, but it was a very rude and surprising thing for a priest to do. And I tried to catch the men in the street. They were too far off, though. I only noticed that they went round the corner into Carstairs Street." The detective was on his feet, with his hat on his head and his stick in his hand. He paid his bill, closed the glass doors loudly behind him, and was soon hurrying round the corner into the next street. It was fortunate that even in such moments of excitement his eye was cool and quick. Something in a shop window went by him like a flash. But he went back to look at it. It was a fruit and vegetable shop, and the goods were arranged in the open air, with tickets on them, plainly showing their names and prices. Right in the front were two piles, one of oranges and the other of nuts. On the pile of nuts lay a ticket on which was written clearly, "Best oranges, 2 a penny." On the oranges was the equally clear and exact description, "Finest nuts, 4d. a pound." Valentine looked at these two tickets and thought that he had experienced this kind of humour before, and that he had done so rather recently. He drew the attention of the red-faced shopkeeper, who seemed in a bad temper and was looking up and down the street, to the mistake in his advertisements. The shopkeeper said nothing, but quickly put each card into its proper place. The detective leaned on his walking stick and continued to look closely at the shop. At last he said, "Please excuse me, my good sir, but I would like to ask you a question which may sound rather strange." The red-faced shopkeeper looked at him threateningly, but the detective continued to lean on his walking stick. "Why are 2 tickets wrongly placed in a fruit shop?" he went on. "Like a priest's hat that has come to London for a holiday. Or, in case I do not make myself clear, what is the connection between the idea of nuts marked as oranges and the idea of 2 priests, one tall and the other short?" The eyes of the shopkeeper stood out of his head. For a moment, he really seemed likely to attack the stranger. At last, he said angrily, "I don't know what you have to do with it, but you can tell them from me that I'll knock their stupid heads off, even if they are priests, if they knock my apples over again." "Really?" asked the detective, with great sympathy. "Did they knock your apples over?" "One of them did," said the angry shopkeeper. "He rolled them all over the street. I would have caught the fool if I hadn't had to pick them up." "Which way did these priests go?" asked Valentine. "Up that second road on the left-hand side, and then across the square," said the other. "Thanks," said Valentine, and moved off quickly. On the other side of the second square, he found a policeman and said, "This is urgent. Have you seen 2 priests?" The policeman began to laugh heavily. "I have, sir, and if you want my opinion, one of them was drunk. He stood in the middle of the road, so confused that—" "Which way did they go?" interrupted Valentine. "They took one of those yellow buses over there," answered the man. "The ones that go to Hampstead." Valentine produced his official card and said very rapidly, "Call 2 of your men to come with me to follow these people." In a minute and a half, the French detective was joined on the opposite side of the road by an inspector and a policeman in plain clothes. "Well, sir," began the inspector, "and what may—" Valentine pointed suddenly with his stick. "I'll tell you on the top of that bus," he said, and ran into the busy traffic. When all 3 sank, breathing heavily, onto the top seats of the yellow bus, the inspector said, "We could go 4 times as quickly in a taxi." "Quite true," replied the leader calmly, "if we had an idea of where we were going." "Well, where are you going?" asked the other. Valentine smoked his cigarette thoughtfully for a few seconds. Then he said, "If you know what a man's doing, get in front of him. But if you want to guess what he's doing, keep behind him. Wander when he wanders. Stop when he stops. Travel as slowly as he does. Then you can see what he saw, and you can act as he acted. All we can do is to watch very carefully for something unusual." "What sort of unusual thing do you mean?" asked the inspector. "Any sort of unusual thing," answered Valentine, and became silent. The yellow bus went slowly up the northern roads for what seemed like hours. The great detective gave no further explanation, and perhaps the other 2 felt a silent and growing doubt about his purpose. Perhaps, also, they felt a silent and growing desire for lunch. For it was by now long past the normal lunch hour, and the long roads through the north of London seemed to stretch on and on. But even when the winter sun was already beginning to set, the Parisian detective still sat silent and watchful, looking out at the shops and houses that slid by on either side. By the time that they had left Camden Town behind, the policemen were nearly asleep. At least they gave something like a jump as Valentine suddenly stood up, struck each man on the shoulder, and shouted to the driver to stop. They hurried down the steps and into the road, without knowing why they were doing so. When they looked round for an explanation, they found Valentine pointing his finger in excitement towards a window on the left side of the road. It was a large window, forming part of the long front of a hotel. It was the part for eating in, and was marked restaurant, and in the middle of the window was a big black hole. "Our sign at last," cried Valentine, waving his stick. "The place with the broken window." "What window? What sign?" asked the inspector. "Why, what proof is there that this has anything to do with them?" Valentine almost broke his stick in anger. "Proof?" he cried. "Good heavens! The man is looking for proof! It is, of course, most unlikely that it has anything to do with them. But what else can we do? Don't you see we must either follow one wild possibility or else go home to bed?" He entered the restaurant with a great deal of noise, followed by his companions, and they were soon eating a late lunch at a little table and looking at the broken glass from inside. Not that it was very informative to them even then. "You've had your window broken, I see," Valentine said to the waiter as he paid the bill. "Yes, sir," the waiter answered. "A very strange thing, that, sir." "Really? Tell us about it," said the detective. "Well, 2 gentlemen in black came in," said the waiter. "2 of those priests that are running around the city at the moment. They had a cheap and quiet little lunch, and one of them paid for it and went out. The other was just going out to join him when I looked at the money he had given me and found that he had paid me more than 3 times too much. 'Here,' I said to the priest, who was nearly out of the door, 'you've paid too much.' 'Oh,' he said, 'have we?' 'Yes,' I said, and I picked up the bill to show him. Well, that was a real surprise." "What do you mean?" asked Valentine. "Well, I could have sworn that I'd put 4 shillings on that bill, but now I saw quite clearly that I'd put 14 shillings. "Well," cried Valentine, with burning eyes, "and then?" "The priest at the door said quite calmly, 'Sorry to confuse your accounts, but it'll pay for the window.' 'What window?' I said. 'The one I'm going to break,' he said, and threw a stone through the window." The inspector said quietly, "Are these people completely crazy?" The waiter continued, obviously enjoying his strange story. "I was so surprised for a second that I couldn't do anything. The man marched out of the place and joined his friend just round the corner. They went so quickly up Bullock Street that I couldn't catch them." "Bullock Street," said the detective, and ran up that road as quickly as the strange pair that he was following. Their journey now took them up narrow brick passages, streets with few lights and even with few windows. The sun had set further, and it was getting dark. It was not easy, even for the London policeman, to guess in what exact direction they were heading. But the inspector was fairly certain that in the end they would reach some part of Hampstead Heath. Suddenly, one gas-lit window broke the half-light, and Valentine stopped for a second in front of a small, brightly painted sweet shop. He thought for a moment, and then went in. He stood among the bright colours of the shop with a serious expression on his face, and chose some sweets with great care. He was clearly looking for an opportunity to ask some questions. But this was not necessary. A thin young woman in the shop had looked at him without interest, but when she saw the door behind him blocked with the blue uniform of the inspector, her eyes seemed to wake up. "Oh," she said, "if you have come about the package, I've sent it off." "Package?" repeated Valentine. "I mean the package the gentleman left. The religious gentleman." "Please," said Valentine, leaning forward eagerly, "tell us what happened exactly." "Well," said the woman, a little doubtfully, "the priests came in about half an hour ago and bought some sweets and talked a bit, and then went off towards the heath. But a second later, one of them ran back into the shop and said, 'Have I left a package?' Well, I looked everywhere and couldn't see one. So he said, 'Never mind, but if you'll find it, please post it to this address.' And he left me the address and a shilling for my trouble. And then, though I thought I'd looked everywhere, I found he'd left a brown paper package, so I posted it to the place he said. I can't remember the address now. It was somewhere in Westminster. But as the thing seemed so important, I thought perhaps the police had come about it." "So they have," said Valentine shortly. "Is Hampstead Heath near here?" "Straight on for 15 minutes, said the woman, "and you'll come right out on the open ground." Valentine hurried out of the shop and began to run. The others followed him rather more slowly. The street that they passed through was so narrow and shut in by shadows that when they suddenly came out into the open park and sky, they were surprised to find the evening still so light and clear. As he stood on the slope and looked across the valley, Valentine saw what he was looking for. Among the dark groups in the distance was one that was especially dark. 2 figures dressed as priests. Though they seemed as small as insects, Valentine could see that one of them was much smaller than the other. The other was slightly bent, but was clearly well over 6 feet tall. Valentine went forward, swinging his stick impatiently. By the time he had shortened the distance and increased the size of the 2 figures, he had noticed something else, something which surprised him, but which he had somehow expected. Whoever the tall priest was, there could be no doubt who the other one was. It was his friend from the Harwich train, the short little Essex priest whom he had warned about his brown paper packages. Now all this was reasonable enough. Valentine had learned from his inquiries that morning that a Father Brown from Essex was bringing up a jewelled silver cross, an ancient object of great value, to show to some of the foreign priests at their meeting in London. This, without any doubt, was the silver cross with blue stones, and Father Brown was undoubtedly the simple little man on the train. Now there was nothing surprising about the fact that what Valentine had found out, Flambeau had also found out. Flambeau found out everything. There was also nothing surprising in the fact that when Flambeau heard of a jewelled cross, he would try to steal it. It was the most natural thing in the world. And most certainly there was nothing surprising about the fact that Flambeau would do as he wished with such a silly sheep as the man with the suitcase and the packages. He was the sort of man whom anybody could lead on a string to the North Pole. It was not surprising that an actor like Flambeau, dressed as another priest, could lead him to Hampstead Heath. So far, the crime seemed clear enough, and while the detective pitied the priest for his helplessness, he thought less of Flambeau for choosing such a simple, trusting person to deceive. But when Valentine thought of all that had happened in between, of all that had led him here, he could see no reason in it. What was the connection between the stealing of a jewelled silver cross from a priest from Essex and the throwing of soup at walls? And how were these connected with calling nuts oranges, or with paying for windows first and breaking them afterwards? He had come to the end of his search, but somehow he had missed the middle of it. He had found the criminal, but still could not understand how it had happened. The two figures that they followed were moving like black flies across the top of a green hill. They were clearly in deep conversation, and perhaps did not notice where they were going. But they were certainly going to the wilder and more silent heights of the heath. As the policemen came nearer, they had to hide behind trees, and even to go along on their hands and knees in deep grass to remain invisible. By these means, the hunters even came close enough to the priests to hear the sound of their discussion. But no word could be clearly heard and understood except the word reason, which was spoken frequently in a high and almost childish voice. Once, over a sudden rise in the ground and in thick bushes, the detectives actually lost the two figures that they were following. They did not find the right path again for an anxious 10 minutes. And then it led round the top of a great round hill, overlooking a wide hollow of rich, empty sunset scenery. Under a tree in this beautiful but lonely spot was an old wooden seat. On this seat sat the two priests, still talking seriously to each other. Valentine signalled silently to his followers and moved forward to hide behind a big, branching tree, where, hardly breathing, he heard the words of the strange priests for the first time. After he had listened for a minute and a half, he experienced a terrible doubt. For the two priests were talking exactly like priests, talking calmly and knowledgeably about religion. The little Essex priest spoke more simply, with his round face turned to the brightening stars. The other talked with his face to the ground, as if he were not fit to look at them. But no more priest-like conversation could have been heard. The first he heard was the end of one of Father Brown's sentences, which was, what they really meant in the Middle Ages by the heavens being unchanging and unchangeable, the taller priest replied, "Ah, yes. Who can look up at those millions of worlds and not feel that there may well be wonderful universes above us where reason is quite unreasonable?" Valentine, behind his tree, was tearing his fingernails with silent anger. He could almost hear the quiet laughter of the English detectives whom he had brought so far on a wild guess, only to listen to the talk of two old priests. When he listened again, it was again Father Brown who was speaking. "Look at those stars. Don't they look like diamonds? But don't imagine that all that study of heavenly bodies would make the slightest difference to the reason and justice of behaviour. In fields of jewels, under hills cut from gold, you would still find a notice saying, 'You must not steal.'" Valentine was just about to rise from his stiff and bent position and to move away as quietly as he could. But something in the silence of the tall priest made him stop until this man spoke. When at last he did speak, he said simply, his head still lowered and his hands on his knees, "Well, I still think that other worlds may perhaps rise higher than our reason. The mystery of heaven cannot be understood, and I myself can only bend my head in respect." Then, with his head still bent forward, and without the slightest change in expression, he added, "Just give me that cross of yours, will you? We're all alone here, and I could pull you to pieces like a child's toy." The completely unchanged voice and attitude added a strange violence to that shocking change of speech. But the little priest only seemed to turn his head by the smallest degree. He seemed still to have a rather foolish face turned to the stars. Perhaps he had not understood. Or perhaps he had understood and sat frozen with fear. "Yes," said the tall priest, in the same low voice and with his head still low. "Yes, I am Flambeau." Then, after a pause, he said, "Now, will you give me that cross?" "No," said the other, and the word had a strange sound. Flambeau suddenly stopped pretending to be a priest. The great robber leaned back in his seat and laughed quietly, but for a long time. "No," he cried, "you won't give it to me, you simple fool. Shall I tell you why you won't give it to me? Because I've got it already in my pocket." The small man from Essex turned towards him what seemed, in the half-light, to be a confused face, and said carefully, Are you sure?" Flambeau shouted with pleasure. "Really, you are amusing," he cried. "Yes, you fool, I am quite sure. I had the sense to make a copy of the real package, and now, my friend, you've got the copy, and I've got the jewels. An old trick, Father Brown, a very old trick." "Yes," said Father Brown, and passed his hand through his hair in the same strange, confused manner. "Yes, I've heard of it before." The great criminal leaned over to the little country priest with a sort of sudden interest. "You have heard of it?" he asked. "Where have you heard of it?" "Well, I mustn't tell you his name, of course," said the little man simply. "He was a man who had come back to the church after a life of crime. He lived very comfortably for about 20 years on copies of brown paper packages. And so, you see, when I began to suspect you, I thought immediately of this poor man's way of doing it." "Began to suspect me?" repeated the criminal. "Did you really have the sense to suspect me just because I brought you up to this lonely part of the heath?" "No, no," said Brown, with a faint smile. "You see, I suspected you when we first met. It's the shape of the gun showing under your coat." "How?" cried Flambeau. "Did you notice that? It's supposed to be invisible." "Oh, one's work, you know," said Father Brown. "When I was a priest in Hartlepool, I knew quite a number of people who always carried guns. So, as I suspected you from the start, I made sure that the cross would be safe. I'm afraid I watched you, you know. So I saw you change the packages. Then I changed them back again, and then I left the right one behind."
"Left it behind?"
repeated Flambeau, and for the first time there was another note in his voice beside victory. "Well, it was like this," said the priest, speaking in the same simple way. "I went back to the sweet shop and asked if I'd left a package, and gave them a particular address if it was found. Well, I knew that I hadn't, but when I went away again, I did. So, instead of running after me with that valuable package, they have sent it by post to a friend of mine in Westminster." He added rather sadly, "I learnt that, too, from a poor man in Hartlepool. He used to do it with handbags that he stole at railway stations. But he's a good man now. One gets to know, you know," he added, rubbing his head. "We can't help it, being priests. People come and tell us these things." Flambeau pulled a brown paper package out of his pocket and tore it open. There was nothing but paper and pencils inside. He jumped to his feet and cried,
"I don't believe you. I don't believe that a simple fool like you could manage all that. I believe that you've still got the cross with you, and if you don't give it up, well, we're all alone, and I'll take it by force."
"No," said Father Brown simply, standing up too. "You won't take it by force. First, because I really haven't still got it, and second, because we're not alone." Flambeau stopped in his step forward. "Behind that tree," said Father Brown, pointing, "are 2 strong policemen and the greatest detective alive. How did they come here, do you ask? Well, I brought them, of course. We have to know about such things when we work among the criminal classes. Well, I wasn't sure you were a thief, and it would not be right to charge one of our own priests. So I just tested you to see if anything would make you show yourself. A man usually complains if he finds salt in his coffee. If he doesn't, he has some reason for keeping quiet. I changed the salt and sugar, and you kept quiet. A man generally objects if his bill is 3 times too big. If he pays it, He has some reason for passing unnoticed. I changed your bill, and you paid it." "Well," went on Father Brown, "as you weren't leaving any tracks for the police, of course somebody had to. At every place we went to, I took care to do something that would get us talked about for the rest of the day. I didn't do much harm: a dirty wall, apples in the street, a broken window. But I saved the cross, as the cross will always be saved. It is in Westminster by now."
"How on earth did you think of these things?" cried Flambeau.
The shadow of a smile crossed the round, simple face of his opponent. "Oh, by being a foolish priest, I suppose," he said. "Have you never thought that a man who does almost nothing except listen to men talking about their crimes is likely to know a little of human evil?" And as he turned to collect his property, the 3 policemen came out from under the dark trees. Flambeau was an artist and a sportsman. He raised his hat to Valentine as a respectful greeting. "Do not raise your hat to me, my friend," said Valentine in a clear voice. "Let us both raise our hats to our master." And they both stood for a moment with their hats in their hands, while the little Essex priest looked around for his suitcase.